So welcome to IBA 614 Global Marketing. Today is our 5th session, and in today's session, we will be taking a close look at global market selection. Now, global market selection in the sense that we are looking at the different opportunities or approaches through which organizations, as part of their global marketing activity, can select the particular markets that they want to enter into. Now, you remember in our previous session, we learned about the theories and the modes or approaches to global market entry. So this global market selection is going to build upon that discussion that we had in terms of the different theories we talked about: the stages theory, the contingency theory, and the interaction theory, and then the various sub-models that we talked about under each of them, including the transaction cost model, the network model, and then the Uppsala model. So in today's session, we'll be building on that by looking at certain specific issues that will help us to achieve the following learning outcomes by the end of the session. The first one is to be able to define international market selection and the determinants of foreign market choice. Because in understanding the various approaches that firms use in selecting which markets to serve, we need to understand that these decisions are made based on certain criteria or determinants. And those are the ones that we will be delving deeper into during this session. We will also be able to explore how international marketers screen potential markets in countries using secondary and primary data, right? Because they have certain criteria that they use in these selections. Like we said, there are certain determinants. Prime among these is secondary and primary data that they obtain from various sources. And then finally, we'll be able to distinguish between the different approaches of global market expansion. Because once a firm decides to go international, it is a means of expanding their reach beyond their domestic market into a foreign market, which will be characterized by a duplication of their efforts from the domestic market into these foreign markets. So we will look at the approaches that firms usually use when they are embarking on this kind of expansion. So these are the learning outcomes we will achieve in a nutshell by the end of the session. So on that note, let's begin by looking at the concept of global market selection. So when we say global market selection, what are we talking about? We are talking about the fact that there are certain bases by which international markets can be defined. And we have talked about these severally, including how they are defined in terms of a country or group of countries when we are describing a region, as well as a group of customers with nearly the same characteristics, which we discussed about when we were talking about market segmentation and targeting and positioning. Now, this is supposed to be able to inform the decision of the global marketer such that they will appreciate the fact that out of these countries or country groupings, as well as customer groupings, there are various possible markets that they can decide to serve as global marketers. So the process of international market selection is important because we have established the limited supply of resources for all firms, given that they cannot afford to take advantage of every opportunity they identify within these different countries or country groups or customer groups. So there's the need for them to sift through the lot and identify which ones they can be able to serve profitably. So when it comes to international market selection, based on what we know from the Uppsala School of Thought under the stages approach to international marketing, we realize that firms can be able to target different markets across the world using two main criteria. The first one is by basing it on firm characteristics. And this is where we are looking at specifically the endowment of the firm. From the perspective of SWOT analysis, we can look at it in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of the organization, which sum up their individual characteristics. And then we need to look externally beyond the firm. In terms of SWOT analysis, we can look at it in terms of the opportunities and threats that are available in the external environment, hence environmental characteristics, which are made up of macro level and micro level environmental characteristics. So we are basically going to be looking at these characteristics in a nutshell and how they inform the firm's choice of a particular market to serve. Now, in determining a choice of market to enter, like we just established, the firm considers their individual characteristics as well as the characteristics of the environment. And from the model we can see on our screen, it usually begins by considering both of these characteristics side by side, as is characteristic of the SWOT analysis that we have been performing. So SWOT captures elements of the firm on one hand, which we can see in the pink box on the left, and then it captures elements of the external environment on the other hand, which we can see in the purple box on the right. So the elements of SWOT that we will see in the pink box that relates to the firm includes the firm's strengths and weaknesses, such as their degree of internationalization and overseas experience, as well as the size and amount of resources that they have, along with the type of industry that they operate in or the nature of business that they engage in, as well as their goals for embarking on this global marketing or internationalization drive, and the existing network of relationships, which we learned from the interaction theory, particularly the network model, can go a long way to determine whether or not a firm is able to successfully internationalize. So these elements relating to the firm encompass the S and W alphabets of the SWOT acronym, which refer to strengths and weaknesses. Then when it comes to the O and T elements of the acronym, which refer to opportunities and threats, we move into the purple box, which deals with the environment that the firm operates in, including the industry structure, particularly the international industry structure, and then the degree of internationalization of the markets in which they are thinking about entering into. And then most of all, the characteristics within the host country, which is a very important predictor of whether or not the firm, once it's able to successfully enter the market, will be able to survive. Even to a large extent, it determines whether or not the firm will even have it easy or difficult making an entry into this foreign market. So in terms of the host country, we can talk about issues like market potential and the level of competition within this market, as well as psychic and geographic distance, which we explained in one of our previous sessions, right? So very quickly, when we talk about psychic distance, what does it mean? When we say psychic distance, what does it mean? And here we mean psychic distance in relation to the home and host country. Yes, Tara, please go ahead.
It talks about the similarities that the two countries have between themselves and not necessarily how close they are geographically.
Excellent.
So it's more of the underlying characteristics that they have. You're welcome.
Yes, please. So in that case, it's one of the key characteristics that we have just identified, including competition and market potential, as well as market similarity, all of which relate to the host country that can influence the choice of a foreign market that a firm decides to enter into. So after considering the SWOT, the firm is able to get a fair idea of the conditions within the environments that they are purporting to enter into, and their internal conditions and how it predisposes them to the conditions in this new environment that they are purporting to enter into, and whether or not they will be able to survive or even succeed. So considering these two together will lead them to what we refer to as international market segmentation. Because once they know what their internal strengths and weaknesses are and what they can handle as an organization, compared with the conditions in the environment, they will be able to segment different chunks of the foreign market that they believe they can successfully enter into or successfully target with a particular global marketing strategy. And out of the segments that they are able to create based on the analysis that they did, they can be able to select one or two markets to be able to target depending on their strengths and weaknesses, as well as the opportunities and threats that were identified. Yes, Elizabeth, please go ahead.
Good evening, Madam.
Good evening, Elizabeth.
Okay, so based on what you have here in the slides, can we refer to the one in the pink box as the micro environment and then the one in the purple box as the macro environment?
No, you cannot, because the micro environment, right, does not capture internal issues within the firm. The micro environment looks at the external environment of the firm. Do you get it?
Okay.
So the one in the pink box includes elements of the micro environment as well as the internal environment.
Okay.
Am I making sense? Or
yes.
Let me break it down further.
So what about if
so you can call what is in the purple box macro environment. That's totally fine. But what is in the pink box, we cannot strictly call it the micro environment because it contains elements of the firm's internal environment. Like for instance, the size and amount of resources that the firm has. That is an internal matter, isn't it?
Yes.
Good. Then when we talk about the type of industry and the nature of the business, when you're talking about the industry, then you have to consider actors within the industry, like competitors and suppliers. These are external to the firm in the micro environment.
Okay.
Good. So the pink box is made up of micro environmental factors and internal environmental factors. And then the purple box is strictly macro environmental factors. I hope you understand now. You. Yes, please. You're welcome, Elizabeth. Okay. All right. So with that being said, a more detailed version of the model we just discussed talks about the different steps involved, right? So this is a more expanded version of the model we just talked about that breaks down further the steps from the analysis of the internal and external environment to the selection of the specific markets that they want to serve. And here it looks at, again, starting from the SWOT analysis, considering the factors relating to the firm as well as the factors relating to the environment, leading into 4 major steps that result in the firm actually selecting 1 or 2 markets to be able to enter into with their products or service for sale. So this starts from step 1, which has to do with the selection of the relevant segmentation criteria, because like we mentioned, the firm will not be able to serve every single international market out there. They need to consider their firm characteristics in terms of their internal factors as well as micro environmental level factors, and then the macro environmental level factors. And based on the analysis they conduct, comparing the situation in both contexts, we'll be able to segment the market into different chunks or segments, which they can be able to target with their global marketing strategy. Now, not every segment would be appropriate because once the analysis is complete and the segments are divided, through further analysis, the firm can be able to determine which of the set of segments that they have created they can be able to serve better than others, right? So because of the fact that there will be a number of segments in the beginning, step 2 is necessary to be able to look at which of these segments they are actually in a position to serve. And that has to do with the development of appropriate segments. So after looking at the segments that they are in a position to serve, they will now go to step 3, which involves screening the segments to narrow down to a final smaller list of segments that they can directly choose from. And once they are able to screen all of them, they will go into the micro segmentation, where they would actually now break down the segments they have identified into other sub-segments. Because we realize that in every foreign market that the firm decides to enter into, there will not be exactly one kind of customer in these markets. Markets across the globe are usually made up of myriad groups of customers with different needs. So by identifying a particular market which they want to enter into, and this is usually done at the country level or regional level, they will now go ahead to develop certain micro segments within these countries or regions to be able to determine which niche markets they can actually serve and serve profitably. And with the information they are able to gather and the segments they are able to come up with, they can now conveniently decide how many of these micro segments they can target, when to target these segments, and in what sequence or order to go about this targeting. So generally in this session, we are going to discuss all that has to do with these different steps and the level of activity that the firm has to perform in each of these stages to arrive at the decision of which market to choose to enter with their marketing offering. So we'll start from steps 1 and 2, which involve defining the criteria for the segments and developing these segments. Now, in general, the criteria for effective segmentation include measurability, in the sense that when you are trying to select segments or you are creating segments based on certain homogeneous characteristics, you need to consider the degree to which the size and purchasing power of the resulting segments can be measured. Remember, we talked about the fact that when it comes to global marketing, a lot of the segmentation is usually done based on what we refer to as the GDP and the GNP. And that is because without the ability to determine whether or not the customer group you are targeting has purchasing power, there's no way you can tell whether they can be able to afford the products that you are trying to sell to them. And to a large extent, the measurability will also help you to be able to determine how to position this product or service that you are offering, whether or not to standardize this or adapt it to the conditions within this market. The only way we can be able to ascertain the size and purchasing power, amongst other conditions in specific markets, is to have the ability to measure them. So if there is no data on such markets, your ability to be able to measure the conditions in these markets and be able to determine whether or not your firm is poised to be able to satisfy the needs of certain consumer groups in these markets, you will virtually not be able to clearly see if your global marketing activities in these markets will be successful. Hence, measurability is of prime importance. Also, we have to look at the issue of accessibility. Now, accessibility refers to the degree to which the resulting segments can be effectively reached and served. Now, there are certain markets that are very difficult and inaccessible to a large number of organizations in different parts of the world. Sometimes it has to do with international regulation. Sometimes it also has to do with geographic distance and the inability of firms to actively transport certain products or services to customers in these markets. For instance, currently one of the most difficult markets to be able to access for the sale of products and services is North Korea. And that is because of various conditions in North Korea, as well as various violations that international organizations claim that the country has performed or engaged in, particularly in the area of human rights. Certain products and services are banned from being transported to the country. And certain countries have even resolved not to do business with that country. Right now, apart from the human rights violations which they have been accused of, which has placed them in a very difficult position with a lot of foreign countries, there's another thing that a lot of foreign countries are very apprehensive about when it comes to North Korea and doing business with them, which can affect the country's accessibility to corporations or companies from other countries who want to do business with them, right? And that is because of what? Who knows this other thing? Apart from the human rights violations, what else is North Korea accused of that makes people from other countries apprehensive?
The threat of war.
The threat of war, exactly, with their nuclear energy, right? So such a market is largely inaccessible to a lot of organizations because even apart from all these things we have talked about, there's very limited information about the country out there. There's limited information about doing business in North Korea, or exporting to North Korea, or marketing to North Korean customers, right? Yes, Juliet, political status and nuclear weapons. Thank you so much, right? So it's one typical market that is inaccessible. Another market that is inaccessible is Yemen. We've all heard of the country called Yemen, isn't it?
Yes, we have.
Yeah.
Yes, go.
Yemen is currently one of the most inaccessible markets in the world. To some extent, it's as a result of its geographical location. And to another extent, it's as a result of the economic situation in the market. Consumers within the market can barely even afford to feed themselves. So it's not profitable for a firm to target customers within this country, because it will be very difficult for them to be able to design an actual market offering that would appeal to customers in this group, right? So accessibility is very important when it comes to developing market segments. Also, we need to talk about the issue of substantiality and profitability, and that takes us back to the Yemen example that I just gave, right? It will not be profitable to serve customers within a market like that because of the nature of the economic situation in that country and the level of purchasing power of the people there. Any organization that targets customer groups within this country is not thinking in terms of profitability, but perhaps maybe thinking in terms of humanitarian grounds, because it may be near impossible to turn a profit by selling to customers in these markets. So for a firm with the intent of making actual profits, they need to think about segmenting the market based on how profitable they are or how substantial the market is in terms of their purchasing power and purchasing volume, to ensure that they can be able to sell enough to attain the levels of profitability that they are looking for. Also, we need to talk about actionability. And this is the degree to which the firm has sufficient resources to formulate effective marketing programs and make things happen. Like I said, resources are not unlimited. And based on the level of a firm's resources, there are certain markets that they may be able to effectively and successfully develop marketing programs for and have the resources to support the implementation or execution of these programs. However, for other markets, based on the demands of the market and the nature of the market, the firm's resources may not be enough to take full advantage of the opportunities within these markets, right? Hence, the importance of actionability, because it's not enough for the market to be measurable and accessible and profitable. The firm needs to be able to effectively develop and fund a global marketing strategy that can help them to be able to serve the market and achieve all the objectives that they set for themselves from the onset, right? So generally, when we are looking at the basis for which firms will segment international market, we can look at it in terms of a continuum based on the factors we just talked about. Looking at markets that possess high degrees of measurability, accessibility, and actionability, right? And the higher the degree of measurability, accessibility, and actionability, the more the general characteristics that this particular market possesses. Because you realize that a lot of the general characteristics are very easy to measure. And once you are able to measure them, they give you a very clear idea regarding the level of accessibility of the market and its actionability. So for instance, in terms of geography, if you are able to determine that a market is either geographically far from you or geographically close to you, it makes it clear to you how measurable that market will be, its accessibility, and its actionability. Likewise, all the other factors we have talked about. For instance, looking at the issue of political factors. If you are able to clearly ascertain the political situation in the country, it makes it fairly easy to determine whether factors within that market are easily measurable and whether or not that market will be accessible or actionable. So for instance, let's take a few examples. If I talk about the political situation in Ghana versus the political situation in North America, we can clearly see the accessibility of both markets, isn't it? Which one will be more accessible? Of the two markets, which one will be more accessible?
I think it will be North America.
North America, yeah. Because based on political factors, we can clearly see, right? Ghana will also be more accessible compared to North Korea because we can clearly see the political situation in both markets, right? However, when we come to the lower degrees of measurability, accessibility, and actionability, we can see that it deals more with specific characteristics, meaning that when we are talking about these characteristics, the level of measurability is less. And the ability to help us clearly determine how accessible and actionable a market is somewhat specific, right? It's somewhat specific. So for instance, if we generally talk about the lifestyles of people in North Korea versus the lifestyles of people in Ghana, you realize that it will be very low on the scale of measurability, isn't it? It will be very low on the scale of measurability, wouldn't it be? Would you agree that it will be low on the scale of measurability in terms of lifestyle?
I don't think I quite get the question, because if you're looking at lifestyle, I think depending on what it's to sell, you could do some analysis on their lifestyle. So I don't see why you would say it's low.
Yes,
because if you wanted
low
to cut something like
yes, but low in terms of, even regardless of which product you were selling, right? If you take a country like North Korea.
North Korea, okay.
Will it be possible at all to even measure their lifestyle in any way, manner, or form?
No.
Not at all.
Because we don't have access to even information, a lot of things we don't even know what's going on.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right, so that makes it highly specific, like you're saying. And for some markets, you do not even have any opportunity at all. So it is very important that once we are thinking on the scale of selecting a market, for firms to be able to make proper choices in terms of their selection, they need to start from the levels of general characteristics that have a higher degree of measurability and have high chances of improving the ability of the firm to determine the market's accessibility and actionability and work their way downwards to more specific characteristics. Because interesting enough, even though the more specific characteristics have a low degree of measurability and have low chances of indicating accessibility and actionability, those are the specific characteristics that help to develop competitive advantage. Would you agree?
Yes, wholly agree.
Yeah, because those are the unique things that are difficult to come by. So once a firm is able to master that, it helps them to set themselves apart from the competition. Elizabeth, please go ahead.
Yes, please. So based on what you're saying, if I understand you right, you're saying that it's quite easier for us to measure the geographic characteristics of a country than attitudes and taste. That is according to what is here.
Yes. Because you realize that a lot of even the information under the general characteristics you can get from secondary data. Do you realize?
Yes, very true.
Yeah, but when it comes to specific characteristics, you may have to commission the study yourself. So they rely mainly on
market research, probably.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's generally about starting from the low-hanging fruits and then working your way towards the more complicated, more complex, more specific niche generating characteristics, which will help you to establish your competitive advantage in the marketplace, right? So based on that, we have been able to appreciate the steps involved in defining criteria and developing segments. So the next thing to do is to be able to screen these segments that we come up with after we have been able to do these segmentation using the various criteria we talked about. Now, in terms of screening, there are two main forms of screening that global marketers engage in. The first one is what we refer to as preliminary screening, right? Also referred to as coarse-grained screening. And then we have the second type, which is referred to as fine-grained screening. So with the coarse-grained screening, it's all about where we are screening primarily according to external screening criteria, right? Like the general characteristics that we talked about, political factors, geographic factors, language, among others. Then the fine-grained screening criteria is where we look at the firm's competitive power. So this one becomes more specific in relation to the firm's internal situation. And this is where we delve deeper into the issue of firm competencies and resources, right? In some literature, you'll see competencies being used synonymously with capabilities. right? And here we delve deeper into the issue of capabilities and competencies by looking closely at distinctive capabilities, or what other literature will refer to as core competencies. So you realize that at the fine-grained screening level, you notice what we end up with after the coarse-grained screening becomes highly specific and customized to the firm's situation based on the firm's unique core competencies, as well as its unique resource endowments. And that is what the fine-grained and coarse-grained screening is all about. So once again, we start from the coarse-grained screening, which is the low-hanging fruit, to give us a general idea of the kind of segment we are working with. And then we go more into fine-grained screening, where we are focusing on our unique advantages by way of competencies and resources to finally screen the segments to pick out those ones that we believe we can serve competitively. Because bear in mind that the segments that you are finding attractive, other firms are also finding attractive. And you need to be able to make sure that once you decide to compete in that market, you have what it takes to create a superior position for yourself in that market, such that you can gain a competitive advantage and maintain it into the long term. So particularly when we talk about preliminary screening or coarse-grained screening, we generally use macro-oriented screening methods, like where we use population size, where we use GNP, which we have discussed in detail in one of our previous sessions, where we use restrictions in terms of the export of goods from one country to another. Currently, if you are a car exporter and you want to export cars to Tunisia, I would advise you not to even think about it. Likewise, countries like India, where tariffs are very high, right? So these are some of the main criteria we use when it comes to coarse-grained screening. Others would use the share of the population with access to the internet, particularly for those organizations that are exporting some kind of technology that is reliant on internet infrastructure. So currently the world is moving towards not just internet access, but meaningful internet access. So it's not just about having access to the internet, like the infrastructure being there and the same internet is available, but it's about having access to internet infrastructure and having access to a device that can help you to connect to this infrastructure, and having the infrastructure to support the speedy access and reliable access to the internet, right? So right now, it's not just about internet access, but meaningful internet access, according to the World Wide Web Foundation. So share of population with meaningful access to the internet is where we are moving towards now, right? And then you can also look at smartphones owned per 1,000 of the population. Again, if you are selling a product that is heavily reliant on smartphone use. For instance, a lot of organizations, including Domino's Pizza, have been able to enter the Nigerian market on the basis of the number of smartphones owned per person and relying on the deployment of their app to be able to slowly grow to become market leaders in terms of pizza delivery in the Indian market, mainly because they noticed the opportunity in the amount of smartphones owned by consumers in the country and leveraged on it to facilitate their movement into that market, right? We can also look at cars owned per 1,000 of the population. Several car companies have gone into India and pulled out, including car giants like GMC and General Motors. However, other car companies are in India and they are surviving. Car companies that are not very popular in other parts of the world, like Suzuki. Suzuki cars are not very common in Ghana anymore, are they? When was the last time anyone saw a Suzuki car around?
It depends on where you live. Oh.
This afternoon. I saw it this afternoon.
Is it a brand new model?
Oh, no.
Exactly. The new models of cars that are coming into Ghana now, Suzuki is not one of the very popular ones. Right? But in India, Suzuki cars are very popular, and the newest models at that, because of a strategic move that Suzuki made to partner with an indigenous Indian company. And we will learn a bit about that in our next session, where we talk about the different modes of market entry. And that is something that falls under mergers and acquisitions, which we will talk a bit about, right? So cars owned per thousand of the population could be another coarse-grained criterion. Remember, all these factors we are discussing are the macro environmental level, which play a significant role in helping to be able to sift out the chaff of the general group of segments that you find. Good, Tata Mahindra is one, right? Then Suzuki and Maruti is the one that I was talking about in terms of the partnership that they did to enter India, right? So well done, Nigel. All right, so these are the coarse-grained criteria. Now, in terms of coarse-grained criteria, particularly, a lot of organizations do not have to go through the hassle to be able to obtain information of this nature, like I just talked about in terms of GNP and GDP and share of population and restrictions in terms of export of goods. We realize that these are mainly general characteristics that can be easily obtained through secondary data, right? And there are two typical examples of this secondary data that I want to introduce you to in this class today. One of them is known as the Business Environment Rankings, which is done by the Economist Intelligence Unit. Now, the Economist is a popular newspaper. I won't call it, some people call it a newspaper, some people will call it a magazine. I call it a publication, right? So it's a business publication that has systems put in place to be able to determine the business environment in various countries and create rankings to be able to guide organizations who seek to do business in these markets. Now, the most recent version of this report that I have is the 2014 edition. There are other editions, but they are offering it for sale. And the amount that they are charging, I'm not ready to part with. So I'm going to show you the 2014 edition. Please, I hope that is okay. So please, I tried my best to get you the most recent edition, but the money they were asking for, maybe we could have done susu and bought it. But if we had bought it, who would have kept it? Tara, if we had bought it, who would have kept it?
Don't they have the online version? We could all have shared.
That's what I'm saying. The online version, they want us to pay for.
Yes, but if we had all put our money together, then we could all have access to it.
Tara, some of them are very smart. They add passcodes and stuff to the thing.
But even Netflix, we're able to watch people's accounts. So
that one is using VPN. So that is different. We use VPNs and things to do that. But this one, it's business intelligence. So Tara.
Oh, the 2014 is fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So please, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
So these are the business environment rankings from the Economist. And like I said, this is the 2014 edition. So please pardon me. I'm usually good at the current affairs stuff, but this one. So you can see that they have ranked all the countries based on certain criteria. So each of these rankings will tell you the criteria that they are using to arrive at their computation. So here you can see that they have ranked the countries from 1 all the way down to, I think, 70 something. Let me quickly check. Okay, they go down all the way to 82, right? So all the rankings that they have done.
Dr. Boateng, it seems like you're muted.
Please give me a moment. Okay, sorry about that. I quickly had to respond to something. Okay, so I'm back. So like I was saying, they rank the countries from 1 to 82. And we can see they have listed the countries and given each of the countries rankings using various criteria. So for this particular report, when you go to the end part of the report, you can see that they break down the way they went about computing the position of each country in the rankings. And they even provide you with the survey that they used to compute the rankings. So we can see from here, all the survey questions are there, right? Starting from sorry, please a moment. This is in the separate document. Okay. So what comes with the report is a document about the methodology with which they arrive at the rankings. Please, can we see that?
Yes, we can.
So they tell you the model that they use, and they tell you, they even give you the survey instrument that they use. So they tell you how they went about during the measurements, the sources of each of the measurement items, the weightings that they used, and then they rank each of them, and then they add the survey. So you can see the questionnaire. Please, can we see the questionnaire?
Yes.
Good.
We can.
So they said it's composed of both quantitative and qualitative indicators, right? So they use an asterisk to indicate which one is quantitative and then which one is partly based on data, right? So they, good. So they explain every single level of the analysis, right? So for those of you who are doing research in this area, perhaps you can use this questionnaire to guide you. They look at the political environment, and under political environment, they consider political stability, which has a number of questions, both qualitative and quantitative. Then they look at political effectiveness, right? Then they go ahead to look at the issue of the macro environment, right? And under macro environment, they look at a number of indicators. You can see that a lot of them are based on financial indicators like inflation, GDP, debt ratios, among others, right? Then after the macro environment, they go into market opportunities, right? Which are also based on a lot of financial indicators like the GDP, and then the number of people in the country, which is the population, GDP growth, share of world merchandise trade, among others, right? So you realize that the entire survey is presented from beginning to end, the questionnaire they use to gather each of the data, plus the weightings that they used for each of them and how they arrived at their final decision of which country should occupy which position in the rankings. So I'm going to attach these documents into the Sakai resources folder so that you can be able to access it and peruse it at your convenience, so that you can be able to familiarize yourself with the approach with which they developed the report, right? So I didn't see Ghana in the first 82 countries that were ranked in this one. I don't think Ghana was there. No, Ghana is not there. And Nigeria is. Interesting, isn't it? Nigeria is there, but Ghana is not. Anyway, this is 2014. Kenya is also there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Ghana is not. Someone will argue that since 2014, things have changed. Right now, Ghana is on top. So let's see. So this is based on environmental rankings, and we can see it combines political factors, opportunities, among other things. So just like this set of rankings, each of the rankings you will come across that are looking at how favorable it is to do business in foreign markets will use their own set of criteria. And I often prefer using the rankings that clearly state their methodology. It helps you to be able to decide which rankings are best suited for your needs as an organization. So we realized that with the business environment rankings, they have a separate methodology document telling us exactly what it is that goes into their computation and how they arrive at each country's position in the ranking. Now, there's another kind of ranking which I want to introduce you to, which I think is brilliant, which is the ease of doing business rankings. This one is done by the World Bank. And unlike the business environment rankings, this one focuses specifically on the regulatory environment in these countries and how it facilitates doing business. And for this particular one, I have the most recent report from 2020. So let me quickly share that one, and then we can look at it. Okay, so this is the report. It's called Doing Business 2020, right? So every year there's Doing Business, then the year that it was published will be included. So it's all about, like I said, comparing business regulation in these different countries. And here they have a total of 190 countries or economies that they are considering. So when you go through the report, you realize that, like the other group, the report we just saw from The Economist. They also provide basic information regarding how they arrive at their rankings. And they give you each of the criteria that were measured to be able to determine the position of each country in the rankings. So very quickly, before we go to the report and see the rankings, let me show you the criteria that they use. Now, because of the nature of their rankings, every year, when they create the new set of rankings, they tell you which criteria were included and which criteria were not included, because for various reasons, certain criteria may become redundant. And that is why like I said, I prefer those reports that give you an accurate indication of their methodology. So with this particular one, you can see that as part of their methodology, they give you the 12 areas of regulation that they consider. Please, can we see that? Please, can we see the screen?
Yes.
Good.
We can see.
So the areas of regulation are 12, starting from the regulation in relation to starting a business. And here they measure the procedures for starting a business, how much time it takes you, the cost involved, the paid-in minimum capital to start a limited liability company. And they do all this in comparison between men and women. Then they're also looking at dealing with construction permits. Again, they look at procedures, time, cost to complete all formalities, to build a warehouse, the quality control and safety mechanisms in the construction permitting system. Now, this is information gold for any organization that knows nothing about the markets that they are entering into. Wouldn't you agree?
Certainly.
Yeah. And then
Very
they also
good.
look good. And then they also look at getting electricity. Wow. Procedures, time, cost, reliability of the electricity supply, transparency of tariffs. Then they look at registering property. Again, procedures, time, cost to transfer a property, the quality of the land administration system. And they are doing this in comparison between men and women. Then they look at getting credit. I mean, any business that gets this report is blessed, because if you are looking at how difficult and easy it is per country on all these key indicators that can determine whether a business does set up shop in the market or otherwise. I mean, this report is something that we should all subscribe to and read every year. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I would.
Yeah.
I also had a question. Would it be possible to use both if you wanted to get a more
That's what
a
I'm
deeper
saying. That
understanding?
exactly, Tara. That's what I was saying, that each of these reports cover different things. So the more of these reports you have access to, the better. Because like you're saying, Tara, you can get some information from one, which will make certain things from other aspects clearer, right? And for me, this doing business report by the World Bank is gold compared to other reports that I have seen that have not given this level of detail, especially if you are looking to do business in an emerging market context, right? The World Bank report is perfect for a firm that wants to enter an emerging market context, because looking at the criteria that they are using, they are criteria that emerging market contexts usually score very low on. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, and with that knowledge, you know exactly how.
So I'm quickly gonna get to the, sorry, Tara, I didn't finish.
Oh, yes, I said that with that information, it makes it very clear for you to know how to enter and whether it's worth going into that market or not.
Exactly, right? And Mariaba is saying that compared to the other one, the World Bank criteria is also easy to understand and simplified for all, which I totally agree with. So let's go into the rankings and look at the countries that are listed. And again, African countries are very few and far between. Right, so you can see that here they also clearly break down their whole methodology, right? They even go ahead to give you a timeline of how the data was gathered. And then they break down each criterion and try to explain it, right? Starting from firm entry to reliability of electricity and all the other factors, right? Tax regulation, all the way down to the last factor that they used in the rankings. So let me quickly go to the rankings and let's see the countries that are featured. Is it this one? These are moments I can't seem to find the page that has the number, the countries listed for the rankings. Okay, so this is the criteria. Okay, so this is how they collected their data. So the data collection process took a number of months. Please, can we see that? So they show you everything from when they developed the questionnaire, how they collected the data and analyzed it, their verification. So if you have such a report and you are relying on it for decision making, like Mariaba and Kafui said, it is very simplified and straightforward. And there's nothing ambiguous about it. You can easily justify it and defend it in the event that you are relying on it to make certain decisions. Wow, why am I unable to locate the countries as they have been listed? The document is so comprehensive, it is taking me some time to find the table that I'm looking for. Okay, I can't find the table, but what I'm seeing at the end is something we can use as a substitute for the table. So generally, after they produce the table with the rankings, they also break it down in terms of which countries did very well on which criteria, right? So they break it down specifically to let us know of the 190 economies that they considered, which ones performed well on which ones and which ones did not on each of the criteria, right? So starting from, let's take it from here. Okay, so they put them in alphabetical order. So starting from those at the top, you can see that for different countries, based on what they were able to measure in those countries, they tell you what they scored well on and what they did not score well on. So for Antigua and Barbuda, they only have information with regard to starting a business, and that is it, right? But for other countries, you realize that they scored them on the different criteria, beginning from Argentina to Armenia to Australia and Austria. Let me see if I can locate Ghana. Now, funny enough, of the ranking, I don't know why I can't find it, but of the top 50 countries in the ranking, great, I found the ranking now. Of the top 50 countries in the ranking, there were only 2 African countries. There are only 2 African countries. Can you guess which countries they are without looking at the list?
Mauritius.
Mauritius is one. Mauritius is the first one you can see, but the second one was very surprising to me.
Yeah.
And Rwanda.
Hey,
Right?
Rwanda.
Rwanda. I was just as surprised as you.
Oh, yes,
Mauritius,
it's very true. It takes a week.
Yeah.
It takes to register a business in Rwanda.
Wow. That's good to know. So top 50, Mauritius and Rwanda. Right? Ghana is number what? 118.
Wow.
We have a lot of work to do.
We do.
Ghana is number 118. We are behind Togo.
Corruption.
So once again,
I'll register a company than before.
Yeah. So once again,
I'm sure the next time will be somewhere 200.
I'm praying we'll do better with the Fix the Country and demonstrations underway. I'm sure we'll move forward.
I think Kenya is also there. Kenya is about 56.
Yeah, we're talking top 50.
Oh, okay.
Yes. In the top 50, there are only 2 African countries. One is not that surprising, one very shocking. But we've just found out that it takes 1 week to register a business in that country. So definitely they'll make it to the list in top 50.
Hey.
Right. So I will attach this again into your resources in Sakai so that you can go through it when you get the chance and familiarize yourself with the methodology and the rankings and everything. I'm sure by the end of the year, a 2021 version will come out. If I get it beforehand, I'll share it with the class so that you can be able to look at it and then compare, see perhaps whether things have improved for some countries or things just go worse, right? So these are two very key rankings that, you're welcome, Tara. So these are two very key rankings that I think as business people, you should lay your hands on and familiarize yourself with, because it does a lot of the groundwork regarding which markets are favorable to enter into and which markets are not, particularly from the global perspective. Okay, so using these resources, yes, Nana, Mariaba, there are cumbersome processes that they go through, but like I said, because they are able to break it down for you, you understand the processes that they went through and you can easily justify relying on their outputs because you can be able to see the methodology that they used to obtain that output. Unlike other reports that don't really tell you how they approached the data collection process and analysis process. That way,
I
when
was
you're
talking
relying...
about Registrar General.
Oh, okay. Yeah, very complex.
I wasn't talking about the process. Yeah, I was talking
about.
Okay.
Because you didn't put it in context, I thought that's what you were talking about.
Okay, sorry.
You're welcome. No problem.
But
okay.
I think
yes, Julia.
The registration of businesses in Ghana will change soon. With I think the government now has Ghana.gov, whatever. It's an app a platform that they've put up. So they have all the.
I've heard about it too. People cannot easily request for PIN numbers now and all that. Yeah, you're right. You're right, Juliet. Let's hope that
so
once
you can register a business.
Juliet, you're breaking up.
Sorry, I was saying that now I think people can register online.
Yes, please. And I think they can also request for TIN numbers and other things like that online as well. We are just praying that they are able to sustain it into the long term, because you realize that the government is currently introducing a lot of e-solutions.
Yes.
We wish them all the best. Kafu, go ahead.
I'm just my mind is just playing around Kigali and Rwanda.
Yeah.
I've heard. I haven't been there myself. I've heard that aside Kigali, the rest of Rwanda seems not to have developed, and most of the development in terms of technology is situated within Kigali. So will we be? So we might have done much. Ghana as a nation might have done much, but because it spans the whole country, it's seen as little. Whilst they might have done little, but then it seems as much when it's considered. Yeah. But I don't know if anyone has been to Kigali. Could maybe let us know much more about it.
Yeah, the lady who shared about.
Is it also not because maybe Rwanda is a new country, like they are not so old as Ghana is?
Oh no, Rwanda is old.
No, but I'm talking about the process. Like they went for war and all those things. You know, maybe it may also
they've got a very good leader now. Yes, they've got a good leader who is transforming. Yes.
So if you give them the number
now, but it started as Doc was saying. I myself, when I saw it, I was surprised because I got that information from The Economist, boarding a flight from Joburg to Accra. So I just took it that I was reading it and they were talking about Rwanda and the things that they've done. And that was where I got to find out that you could just get your business registered in a week.
Yeah.
Okay.
Calfry, please go ahead.
Sorry. So this is Peter. I didn't know I was using a company handle. So I think we need to understand that in the case of Rwanda, they've actually kind of taken a step to brand the country.
Yeah.
It's a lot around branding, and they really, because of their experience, you know, they've experienced a long period of war and civil war and all that.
Yeah.
So Kigame has actually spent a lot of time trying to rebrand Rwanda as a place where people should come and do business, right? So
yeah.
As much as people are seeing the other part of Rwanda, I've been there a couple of times. I'm actually thinking of how to move my business there because of how easy it is. Like I have startup friends over there who started business. The government is supporting them. The first 3 years, we are not paying taxes.
Yeah.
You know, like they really support them. They give them mentorship. In actual sense, most of our corporates, like most of the companies are headed by Ghanaians. Like the big companies there are headed by Ghanaian, managers, right? So they actually admire Ghanaians and they learn a lot from us. They believe that we are some kind of like very intelligent, smart, and we want to do things, but they spend a lot of time trying to get as much talent in there and support people to grow. And so when you go to Rwanda and come back, there's no way you can say bad things about it, because I've been there. Like the first time I went there and they took my black, normally I put some things, my shoes inside a black polythene rubber before I put it in my bag. They took it out and like they took it out and I'm like, I went. Yeah, like they said, I couldn't send at the airport. They told me I cannot send plastic into the country. Like they took it out. They said you have to take it out. You can't send it inside the country. You are not allowed to. And I had passed through Nairobi, so it was a bit, embarrassing because I brought it from Ghana, went through Nairobi, and then got to Kigali, and then they took it. So I think that the whole idea is to make Rwanda a destination, and that is why they sponsored and the English Premier League team. I think they did a whole lot of things to just sponsor.
Yeah.
And that is what is putting them on the map. But I guess if you compare Ghana in other ways to Rwanda, like for instance, crime rate, murder and other things, definitely it's still happening there.
Yeah.
But they are putting themselves in a way that people are willing to say good things about them.
Yeah.
And so that's the branding that we are not getting. But it doesn't mean Ghana is not doing well. It's just that we are not able to brand ourselves well to attract people, or maybe
we need better nation branding, eh?
Yeah.
MPP, NDC branding.
Yeah. Well, maybe there's hope for Ghana. Our PhD student who graduated today did his thesis on nation branding. So there's hope. Maybe he's going to influence the system for the better.
I don't
someone
that
has
we are
a
not
different
Ghana
opinion.
well.
Yeah.
Juliet, is that you?
Yes, please.
Okay, please go ahead.
I don't agree with him that we are not branding Ghana well. Because we've been hammering on branding Ghana. The other time I even saw an ad on CNN where Ghana is advertising that it's attracting investors to come to Ghana.
Yes.
But when you look at Ghana and Rwanda, Rwanda has, it's more about what we see, the proof that truly we want to do this.
Exactly.
But with Ghanaian or in Ghana, we have just said it, but when you come, it's nothing. It's
so
like
Juliet, following from what you are saying, so my question is, are these people who are branding Ghana aware of how we are being portrayed in these reports that are being produced globally? Are they aware of our rankings?
Good question.
Because if they knew our rankings, that should be the focus of the branding, isn't it? To help improve our position in these
They know. They know, but I think the problem is somehow coming from we Ghanaians or some Ghanaians, because as he was saying, when he got to the airport, he was told that he couldn't bring the plastic into the town, like into the country.
Yes.
So it was taken out. But this is the case whereby especially with this COVID issue that happened. You know, when people were coming, they were asked, I think from a particular date, it started on a Sunday. They were being asked to be quarantined at these various hotels.
Yes.
And you wouldn't believe that an official at the airport sneaked someone just because he was giving money.
Wow. That's an issue of national security.
Yeah, can I come in quickly? I just wanted to say, yeah, so I do think Rwanda actually put a big budget for rebranding. It's more about rebranding than branding, because for them, it's about a country image that has been soiled by civil war and
a
a
lot
long
of
period of
unrest,
crisis and everything. So they made a decision that they wanted to have a different image, not the image that we knew Rwanda for. So they put a lot of emphasis, but I do think that in Ghana, we do seem to have that cliche that, oh, you know, Ghana is a destination in West Africa, you know, and we forget that these new nations, like
they actually said we are the gateway, Pete, the gateway to West Africa.
Absolutely. But you see, we take it, I guess we are doing it, but also it's about continuity and consistency. Like every government comes in, there is a new way of how we want to do business with like there seems not to be, because I remember Rawlings' time, you know, Clinton came, you know, a lot of things used to happen at that time, you know, and at any given time that we have someone coming in or a prominent person comes in, there is something happening, you know, some drama everywhere, and then we are cleaning the street, we are doing all that. But then right after, we go back to our normal way. So I remember during this, I think this return, something return, like they were doing something. And
year of return.
Year of return.
Exactly. You know, I was so enthusiastic because I was in the US at that time, and I was like, you know, I only heard it from Ghanaians, not from, you know, the Black American. I was in Texas, and there were a lot of Black Americans. My barber was a Black, and I talk a lot nice things about you know, Ghana, and he doesn't know. Yet we were saying we wanted to attract these people to come to Ghana. So I think we don't have a national policy about how to improve our visibility, and that is I guess that is the biggest challenge we face now.
Yeah, and Nigel and Priscilla agree with you on that one, that we need a national agenda or policy to be able to address this issue. All right, so thank you all for your meaningful and insightful contributions. These are the level of articulate strategic thinkers that we need to move the country forward. So thank God for all your lives. And I hope all the lessons you are learning from this course are going to help to improve our situation as a country. All right, so that is it for the coarse-grained screening. See, I've seen cow tribe so many times that I'm pronouncing cow. So that is it for the coarse-grained screening, right? And then beyond that, like we said, the coarse-grained screening is just a general level screening. But to be able to get to the nitty-gritty of which of these markets is really going to be a source of competitive advantage for us in terms of our operations alongside competitors in that market, we need to go more in depth and look at our internal situation as an organization and compare our competencies with our resources and what position it puts us in respect of the various segments we have identified and how well we will or will not be able to serve them. So for this purpose, firms must conduct what we refer to as the market attractiveness / competitive strength matrix. So here it's all about the firm filling a matrix that helps them to ascertain how attractive a particular segment is to them, and then how well they are poised to compete. Right? Oh, Anita, you said it's intentional, cow tribe to the world. I guess so. Okay.
Yes, Doc.
So like I was saying, in terms of market attractiveness and competitive strength, there's a matrix that the firm has to build. And by the end of that matrix, they'll be able to clearly determine whether this market is attractive enough to pursue and whether or not they have the strength to be able to compete with the level of competition in this market that they have deemed attractive enough to look into. So there are separate matrices for these two aspects. There's one for the market attractiveness, and then there's one for the competitive strength. Now, by the end of filling in each matrix, the firm ends up with a score over 100. And depending on how high the score is, for instance, for market attractiveness, we'll be able to determine whether or not a market is attractive enough to pursue. Likewise, in terms of competitive strength, the higher the score, right, over 100, the more competitive the firm will be in this market that they are purporting to enter into. So in terms of market attractiveness, the firm can consider issues like the size of the market, right? And all these are graded on a scale of 1 to 5, ranging from 1 being very poor to 5 being very good. And then they'll give a percentage weight factor to the resulting score, and then they will give it a weight, right, over 100. And that will determine whether or not this market is attractive, right? So the firm can decide how many factors they want to be able to put in this matrix, or they want to measure using the matrix. They just have to make sure that the percentage weighting factor is such that they will end up with a score over 100. So here we can see that they have a number of factors relating to market attractiveness, and then they put ETC at the end, meaning that there's no limit to the number of factors you can include in the market attractiveness matrix, right? And these will range from market size to market growth, to the buying structure in the market, to prices, to the buying power of the populace, access to the market, competitive intensity, as well as political and economic risks. All these are factors that can be considered in relation to the attractiveness of a particular market. And in terms of the relative competitive strength, and this is done with regard to the strongest competitor. So you fill each of these boxes with the score on each of the criteria based on how your competitive strength ranks against the strongest competitor in that market on the criteria in question. So for instance, if you are talking about the products fit to market demands, you need to compare your product to that of the strongest competitor and give yourself a ranking. Then in terms of prices and conditions, you need to compare yourself to your strongest competitor and then give yourself a rankings. Likewise, market presence, marketing, communication, obtainable market share, and then financial results. All of these are going to be ranked in comparison with those of your strongest competitor. So by the time you finish, based on how much you make out of 100 points, you will know how competitive you are in relation to the strongest competitor. Please, I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
Great.
So it's like a scorecard with which you just tally yourself up in terms of whoever is the strongest competitor in the market you're trying to enter.
Exactly.
It's clear. Thank you.
Right. But the key here, like I always tell the organizations that we usually do trainings for, is about learning to be objective. Right. Thank you, David. It involves sincerity. Most people in organizations will usually like to be able to see themselves in a positive light, but this is not the time to try and make yourself look good. This is the time to be honest with yourself as an organization and know what you can and cannot do, what you have and what you do not have, and how to be able to eat humble pie when it comes to some of these criteria and how you measure up against the competition, right? So in as much as it is very objective, the firms have to also be sincere in terms of how they go about ranking themselves using the various criteria, right? So that is it for the fine-grained and coarse-grained screening. So once the screening is done, the next thing is to look into developing the sub-segments in these different markets that we are talking about, which are usually countries or regions. So you notice that we have discussed all these sub-segments in our previous session. Remember the session where we talked about, segmentation, targeting, and positioning. We discussed everything from demographic factors to economic factors to lifestyles, consumer motivations, geography, buyer behavior, psychographics. We talked about all these things. Now, to be able to assure myself that you actually remember what we are saying, when it came to the values, lifestyles, and attitudes, there was a framework we discussed that came with a survey. Do you remember?
The VALS framework.
The VALS framework. How many of you were able to go and assess yourselves using the framework? I'm sure you didn't find time.
I almost did today.
Oh, please, when you get the chance, please do. It's a very interesting exercise. So generally, we have discussed all these things, right? And here we are saying companies competing internationally should segment the market on the basis of these consumer characteristics that we have identified. Because the initial level of creating the segments, doing the coarse-grained screening, is done at the country and regional level, which involves various countries. However, in developing sub-segments, we need to step down from the country level to the consumer level, so that we can be able to identify niche markets with niche opportunities that the firm can take advantage of to create a sustainable competitive advantage for themselves. So after that, the next step is to be able to look at the market entry stage. And the market entry stage here is discussing mainly the decision that the firm has to make regarding how many of these sub-segments that they want to enter into, and when they want to go about entering these markets. And then ultimately deciding the sequence with which to enter these markets, which are entry modes. And we will discuss those in tomorrow's session into detail. However, in today's session, we will look at the first two, being how many markets to enter and when to go about entering these markets. I saw a hand up, or your question has been answered. Was it Pete? Pete, are you okay?
Yes, Doc. Yes, I was just sharing another, you know, sometimes some firms also use other social dynamics to determine whether they should enter or not. And so
yeah,
I remember there's this site, I just posted a link on the chat,
okay,
where you can actually compare different countries. So it's more related to the, yeah, it allows you to compare different. Sometimes it's just good to compare. It normally helps you to know the human, it's something, they call it something index, or yeah, to know whether life expectancy in those places, you know, crime rates and other things compared to your home country. So at least you have a baseline to know, to compare it with. So that is a good tool. People can also use for that. Yeah.
Great, Pete. Thanks for sharing. Right. So please, you can check it out. The link is in the chat section. All right. So like I was saying, in terms of step 5 involving market entry, in today's session, we'll be looking at the first 2 bullet points, which have to do with how many markets to enter and when to enter these markets. So in terms of how many markets to enter and when to enter these markets, the focus will generally be on what we refer to as market expansion. Because depending on how many markets you decide to enter and when to enter these markets, the firm will be ideally embarking on some form of expansion, meaning that they are going beyond the geographic boundaries of their home country to look at other markets, which could be one or more. And the sequence in which this can be done will be determined by the firm's strategy and a number of criteria, which we are going to talk about. So looking at market expansion strategies, the first point of call is to be able to appreciate the concept of market expansion strategies. And that flows largely from what we discussed earlier about the fact that the firm does not have unlimited resources. And because of that, they will not be able to serve every market. So by the time they identify which segments and sub-segments they want to serve, they need to now come up with a strategy of how to enter these markets. Now, based on the concept of market expansion strategies, it is very important for us to understand that different patterns are likely to cause the development of different competitive conditions in different markets over time. Meaning that depending on how you enter the market, It will determine whether or not you are able to remain competitive in that market into the long term or otherwise, right? So for instance, if in your expansion strategy as a firm, you intentionally select a few markets to be able to develop intensely so that you can be able to build your market share in those markets, it means that by choosing those few markets and focusing your efforts, building a high market share in the short term will be able to carry you into the foreseeable future in the event that new competitors enter the market, right? Unlike if you chose an alternate strategy that involved focusing on a large number of markets and not being able to clearly develop a high market share in any of them. However, you have somewhat of a fair competitive position in them. It means that your position in the industry against other competitors in that specific market is fairly undetermined, given that you do not have that much of a strong market share in those specific markets or countries. So market expansion strategies and the patterns in which firms proceed on this expansion is something that is very important to global marketing and that we are about to consider. So when it comes to market expansion, there are two main ways or patterns that firms choose to do this market expansion. The first pattern has to do with how they enter the market, right? And the other one has to do with the sequence. So in terms of sequence, the firm can decide to either enter the market incrementally, being step by step. Please, which approach or market entry theory is this?
Stages.
Stages, good. Particularly Uppsala. Thank you, David. So this sequence is the incremental sequence, also known as the waterfall approach. And then we have the simultaneous sequence. Which of the approaches is simultaneous a semblance of?
Is it the network?
Network, yes, network will work. That's under interaction theory, isn't it? But there's another one that is more suited than network. Which one is that? Amity, you want to try?
The transaction cost.
Transaction cost, the contingency, right? Because if it is cost effective for the firm to be able to enter different markets simultaneously, they will do so, right? So the incremental approach, like we said, is very representative of the Uppsala model or the stages approach. And then the simultaneous approach is more representative of the interaction and contingency models, which are specifically related to the transaction cost analysis and the network approach, right? Now, aside from that, we have the patterns. And here, the patterns of which markets to enter into could either be in a concentrated pattern, where the firm enters few markets at a time, or a diversified pattern where a firm enters several markets at a time. Right? So we're going to look at each of these and break them down, starting from the sequence, whether incremental or simultaneous. So for the incremental approach, like we know from the Uppsala model, it is where a firm will usually enter a single key market in order to build up experience in international operations and then subsequently enter other markets one after the other. Now, by way of revision, why would a firm decide to enter one market at a time? And what are the characteristics of these markets that they usually choose to enter at a time? Yes, Tara. Tara, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I said one of the characteristics that they use to select the countries they enter to are geographical characteristics. They usually start with countries that are closer to them. So not necessarily psychic distance, but more of the kingdom.
Good. Right? So that's one of the key characteristics that they look into. And that is because by entering into a country that is geographically close and has a limited psychic distance from the home country, they can be able to learn gradually and build up experience, right? Before they are able to move to other markets that are more geographically dispersed from them and have a high amount of psychic distance between themselves and the home country, right? So the incremental approach involves the use of a clearly defined entry stages and sequential use of experience, as we have just established. So if they have not gained enough experience with a country that is close enough, that they can handle, that they believe that is more similar to the home market, they will not be able to gain the experience that they need to be able to ensure that they can be able to survive in other markets that are of a higher psychic distance and are more geographically dispersed from themselves. So that is the direct explanation of the incremental approach when it comes to how firms choose to use that approach in entering foreign markets. Now, again, the incremental approach, particularly in the sale of products and technology that are relatively new or expensive, firms would usually start by selling this product or service in more advanced or wealthy countries that can use or afford the product at that point. And then over time, they will be able to extend it to other countries, perhaps less wealthy countries or less advanced countries, once the price of the original product begins to drop, right? Because as the price begins to drop, the firms can now be able to sell to consumers in less developed countries who perhaps do not have the purchasing power that consumers in these advanced countries possess. So consequently, following this approach, a firm may decide to enter international markets on an incremental basis, starting from the more advanced countries all the way down to the least advanced countries, or incrementally from countries that are more geographically close and psychically close, and then gradually moving towards more psychically distant and geographically distant countries, right? Priscilla, you said pharmaceutical companies. Do you care to explain?
Yes, Doc. So to your point, so for example, Johnson & Johnson, they would research and bring out an innovation. So let's say in prostate cancer, right?
Yes.
And for them, their innovations are incremental. So let's say a product for prostate cancer that was developed 20 years ago.
Yes.
And 20 years after, they would have developed upon it like the one that was first developed now probably has lost its patent, and they are able to sell it into in these like developing countries at maybe 1/10 of the price, or even as an access program free of charge. Whilst they sell the newer brands that are reimbursed by NIST or the government, you know, to the European and the US markets.
Yeah, excellent example. Thank you so much, Priscilla, for making that clearer for us. Okay, so like Priscilla said, that's the incremental approach as we just discussed. Now, the alternate to that is the simultaneous approach. And this is where the firm decides to enter several markets simultaneously all at once. And this is often where they identify certain core competencies and resources that they have in these different markets. So they believe that with the competencies and resources that they have, they can be able to leverage them in all these markets at the same time, rather than going step by step, right? So the company will often receive profit and internationalization knowledge from each of these markets. And therefore, as they gain knowledge from one market, they apply the lessons from it in the other markets which they are operating in real time, at the same time. And then as they get profits from one market, they're able to use it to support operations in these other markets, right? The only problem with the simultaneous approach is that compared to the incremental approach, it is more high risk, because if you're operating in more than one market at a time, and things don't necessarily go well in more than one of these markets, it can largely affect your operations, such that you may have to pull out of some of these markets, and it may be difficult for you as a firm to return back to operating in these markets. So even though the simultaneous approach is highly desirable, especially for firms that have competencies and resources to successfully pull it off, it is a high risk approach. But for firms that have the resources and the competencies and are able to succeed at it, it is also high reward, in the sense that they can benefit immensely from doing their global marketing activities simultaneously in all these markets. So by way of diagrammatic representation, just like Priscilla explained to us, for the incremental approach with companies like Johnson & Johnson, you realize that when the drug is new, it will start in the advanced countries, right? Because then it is very expensive. The patent is in full force, and people in the less developed countries can't afford. But as time goes on, the patents die out, and then it becomes cheaper to be able to sell to the countries in the less developed and developing countries, right? However, for the shower approach, all these countries are served at the same time with the same product, sometimes with minor adaptation, depending on the approach of the organization, whether they are using a strategic adaptation or a strategic standardization approach. So that way, you realize that the firm is selling almost the same thing in all these markets, unlike in the incremental or waterfall approach, where it moves gradually from the more developed to the least developed countries. Apple uses the shower approach. Yes, Priscilla, but I think in the beginning, Apple was using more of the waterfall approach. It's just recently that the shower approach is being utilized. And even that, it takes some time for the new ones to get to Ghana. Or, Juliet, please go ahead. Sorry, I just saw your hand. Juliet, please ask your question or make your contribution.
Please, I wanted to ask that, in your opinion, which of these approaches are okay for any business that wants to enter a new market should use?
Juliet, it's not a one size fits all. So like we said, depending on the initial assessment, using the coarse-grained screening, and then our fine-grained screening as an organization, we will be able to then determine which one is best for us in the product or service that we are selling. So the major take home from this is that there's no one size fits all approach when it comes to global marketing. It's about being able to assess the context that you're operating in, the environment that you are doing business in, both at the micro and macro level, as well as your own internal environment. And let that guide your decision as to whether or not the waterfall or the shower approach is what is best suited for the organization at that point in time. Juliet, I hope you understand my point.
Yes, please.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Juliet. Tara, please go ahead.
Okay, so my comment is in regards to the question you asked about the Apple products.
Yeah.
Saying that they use the shower approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so I also agree with you that they do, but in terms of their goods arriving in some other countries, for example, in Ghana, I'm not sure if there's an authorized product was supposed to be released on Friday. They would also have it on Friday ready to hit the markets. So in that case, exactly. So even though the new product is accessible to all markets, it may just take, it may hit certain markets a little slower just because of the transport logistics that would fall in, but not because they are purposely waiting for one style to become redundant before they pass it on. So that was just what I wanted to add to the comment on Apple product.
Yeah. And you realize that whole lawsuit about they were trying so hard to push the shower approach that they were forced to use other unconventional means. Remember the lawsuit about they intentionally slowing down older models of the iPhone?
Exactly. And yes, because even if you update with a new operating system, the operating software, it still wouldn't be fast enough. And then it also took up a lot of the storage on your phone as well. So they got into
there were even bugs on the old one.
Yes.
There were bugs on the old versions.
Yeah. Right. So I think in a sense, this goes back to the question Juliet asked. It's about the firm's strategy and how they believe they should approach their global marketing. Right, Pete, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say maybe at some times it will be determined by what would be required for them to be competitive in the market. For instance, I know some of them, it's actually important for economies of scale. For instance, it depends on the type of business you do. You would need to go to multiple markets to be able to probably get to your break-even point as quickly as possible. I know Uber, for instance, needed that. You know, it was part of the entire business model is around, you know, getting as quick as possible to new markets, because you cannot actually you can't be profitable in one market, you know, in a longer period. Like, you need to get out as quickly as possible. So I think recent business model, especially technology-based companies, need to actually just like have that kind of shower approach or something, because it's not possible to do the waterfall. It's just going to take you longer time. And the second thing I also noticed was, like,
but you also can't justify sorry, before you go ahead, you also can't say all technology, because you know some technology companies serve different kinds of money. For instance, when we divide the market into business to consumer markets and B2B markets, you realize that in serving B2B markets, for a technology company, the shower approach may not necessarily work.
Absolutely, I agree.
Good.
I agree.
Right.
Yeah,
so perhaps your hypothesis will be very best suited for B2C markets. Whereas in the B2B context, we may consider more of a waterfall approach.
Exactly. Yeah. And the second one is more around even the technology being used, if it's a technology-based business.
Yeah.
I did have a concern when we were trying to buy, you know, pharmaceutical products from China, and I realized they don't sell innovator drugs; they sell generic, and the same for India.
Yeah.
And I tried to investigate and realize that actually they position themselves to just like look at the expired patents and then just kind of like pick, because it's very cheap.
Yeah.
It's cheaper, and so they decided to rather focus on African markets with their generics instead of, you know, European, because then you need to develop your patent, which takes so many years to get. So
Pete, what you just talked about is the concentrated approach, where they are concentrating on, like you said, just the emerging markets or the less developed countries. Because with the expired patents, they can produce it at a cheaper rate.
Absolutely. And I thought it was a smart idea, right? I was really, really impressed about how they're able to do this quickly and able to get things to Africa at a cheaper price compared to the same product in the US. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly. So you realize that with the COVAX program, even the AstraZeneca vaccines that we are taking are manufactured right here in India. Did you know that?
And now that India will give us vaccines, we are in trouble. I don't know where we're going to get
the second batch has come in. Ministry of Health has actually rolled out the vaccination for those who are due for a second dose. So they've actually come in.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I saw the letter this morning. The university circulated it to ask faculty to go and get vaccinated at the university.
Yeah, it's true.
And are we getting it from India? Because I think they were complaining they didn't have enough vaccines.
I believe so. I believe we are getting it from the same place.
Okay.
But I also heard that the Russian vaccine is also in the system. So I don't know how they are doing the two. Anyway. Kafui, please go ahead. Thank you, Pete, for your insightful comments. Kafui, please go ahead.
Prof, I was just wondering, product versus service, would we use the same approach? Because when I heard you continuously made mention about products, and then most of the examples that were given were about products.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, in service, would we use the same approach, or which approach would be better suited for?
Okay, you realize that in terms of service delivery, it is by virtue of the nature of a service, it does not obey the rules that a product does. However, when it comes to global marketing, they all suffer the same fate in terms of the differences within markets, such that when it comes to a product or service, you either have to standardize or adapt. Now, this goes back to the B2B, B2C approach that I was talking about. For service delivery in B2B markets, there are certain idiosyncrasies that will not allow you to use a shower approach. Are you with me?
Yes, please.
Good. Likewise, if you were selling a service in the B2C market, there is some characteristics that will enable you to use a shower approach. Like for instance, a standard banking hall should be a standard banking hall, isn't it? There are certain key features that have to go. So there are aspects of service delivery that can be distributed to foreign markets using the shower approach. And there are certain aspects that you have to go waterfall. For instance, this whole banking short code thing, it was very popular in Nigeria before Ghanaians even thought about it. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
GT Bank started it in Nigeria.
Okay.
Yeah,
with 737.
Yes. They even made a song out of it.
Exactly. I talked with it for so many months, almost a year or two. Then I saw the short code in Ghana, and the students in Ghana were like, hey, Doc, the thing you talked about, they started in Ghana. I say, yeah, that's what happens. So in that case, that is a waterfall approach. They use the lessons from the home country before they started extending it. So, and now the short codes are popular in almost all the banks in Ghana, isn't it?
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So, like I said, it's not a one size fits all. You as a strategist have to be aware of the approaches and use the analysis that we did to be able to determine which approach is best suited for what you're selling, whether it's a product or service, and the market that you're selling it to.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome, Kafui. Juliet, your hand is still up. Is it the same old one or it's a new one?
I think it's the old one. Sorry, please.
All right. That's fine then. Okay. So like Pete was saying, when we think about all these approaches, it brings up certain interesting things in terms of how various organizations and corporations decide to expand, right? So for instance, if a firm decides to choose an incremental approach, it's because of the benefits they have identified they can gain from it. And these include the fact that using an incremental approach to enter various markets is usually preferred when a firm is now starting out with very limited resources and very limited experience. It helps to be able to test out your competencies in a small area and then slowly take on more, right? Rather than just taking on so much and not being able to handle it and then losing out on the whole opportunity altogether, right? So this incremental approach usually helps firms, particularly SMEs, who do not have that much power in terms of competition and competing in these cutthroat industries, and also in terms of resources. So this approach is very favorable to organizations of that nature who have a lot to learn in order to be able to become familiar with the environments they are entering into, and then will slowly take on more as they learn more about the market, right? The incremental approach is also preferable if the firm is entering into international markets late. Now, if you're entering into a market that is already full of a lot of competitors, it's like entering into going to the sea and wanting to dive, and you're already seeing a lot of sharks circling your boat. You need to beware, because you do not know how long they have been in the system, what experiences they have gathered, what networks of relationships they have built, how much they know about their environment, and how powerful they are in terms of how they control the dynamic in that particular market. So the incremental approach helps you to be able to take baby steps in terms of learning the conditions in these markets, the behavior of these competitors, how competition in that market is like, and how you are going to position yourself entering into this market in relation to all the competition that you are seeing, right? So if you are a firm that doesn't have enough to be able to take high levels of risk, the incremental approach is the best for you. However, if you are a firm that is not averse to taking risk and has the necessary resources and competencies to take advantage of various markets at a time and sees various opportunities in these markets regardless of the intensity of competition, then the simultaneous approach is best for you. And a lot of firms are able to use this simultaneous approach to enjoy economies of scale, sometimes in production and sometimes in marketing, by using their competencies and resources in these various markets to be able to create these economies of scale through the consolidation of their operations across these markets, right? But like I said, if you are a firm just starting out and you do not have the resource strengths and the strengths in terms of core competencies to take on these huge levels of risk and to combat these fairly dangerous markets that have a lot of intense competition, then it's better you go for an incremental approach and then learn the ropes till you are experienced enough to take on more levels of risk. So like I was mentioning, when Pete was giving us the example about the Indian manufacturers in the pharmaceutical sector taking advantage of expired patents to manufacture drugs for sale to customers in emerging markets at a fairly cheap price, I was saying that it is directly indicative of the concentration approach to global marketing versus diversification, right? So here we are talking about the fact that in terms of the concentration approach and the diversification approach, the firms have to decide whether they want to serve a limited number of similar markets or diversify to several different markets, often with varied characteristics. So a company may concentrate its efforts by entering countries that are highly similar in terms of market characteristics. And like Pete said, these developing markets that the Indians sell to are highly similar in terms of market characteristics when we consider the economic situation and the purchasing power and the ability to afford these expensive pharmaceutical products. So by the Indian drug manufacturers focusing on these markets, they are concentrating on these markets that have fairly low purchasing power, and the best alternative perhaps to access these pharmaceutical products is by means of the Indian alternative, which is cheaper compared to the original drugs that are produced in more developed and advanced countries, right? Whereas alternatively, a company may prefer, rather than to concentrate, to use a more diversified approach. Now, this diversified approach has some advantages in comparison to the concentrated approach, because when a firm is concentrated in a particular market with similar characteristics, it means that their eggs are somewhat in one basket. So a failure in one or more of these markets could sink the firm's entire operations in this concentrated segment. However, when it comes to diversification, the risk is somewhat diversified, such that they have stakes or interest in different markets that they serve, right? So in the event that certain conditions or environmental factors change in one particular market, the firm can rely on other markets to be able to stay afloat, rather than concentrating all their efforts in one or two or just a few segments and risking losing all their investments in these markets in the event that there is a change in the environment in these particular markets that they are concentrating all their efforts on. So in that regard, firms are always encouraged, particularly in the case of markets that are heavily competed, markets where customers have access to various products of a similar nature that tend to satisfy a particular kind of need. Firms who wish to serve these markets are advised to go for a diversified approach. Because in this case, you realize that the competition will not be the same in all the markets. Definitely the level of competition will be different depending on the markets that you are considering. And the adverse conditions in one particular market may not necessarily be replicated in another market, right? So if the conditions become adverse in one market, the firm could offset the losses they are making in this market where conditions are not necessarily conducive with the returns they are making from markets that have good conditions, right? So for instance, if there's an economic recession in one country, the firm would always be able to counterbalance with another country that is not facing recession, that perhaps is facing a boom, right? So profits in a relatively protected or less competitive market can be funneled into fiercely competitive markets to keep the firm afloat in those markets, which cannot be achieved with a concentrated approach where all the markets have similar characteristics, such that a change in the environment in one market is likely to be experienced in some of the other markets. Hence the argument for a diversified approach. And by using a diversified approach also, firms are able to diversify their risk because the levels of risk in different markets will differ. So if you are in a very high risk market, you can offset it with operations in another market that is relatively low risk, so that whatever losses you make as a result of the high risk in one particular market can be offset by the low risk and the boom that you are experiencing in another market. So in terms of concentration and diversification, the argument is often in favor of diversification. However, in cases like the example that Pete gave, in cases like the example that Pete gave, it is obvious that the concentration approach is the best approach because it is the markets of that similar characteristic who require that kind of service. And therefore, by focusing on them, they are able to make their returns as they expect. So this table in a nutshell shows us the factors favoring country diversification and the factors favoring country concentration, right? And these are differentiated along the lines of company factors, product factors, market factors, and then marketing factors. So it goes back to what I said in regard to deciding which strategy is best suited for a firm. It all has to do with the environmental analysis and the internal analysis. So the environmental analysis, also known as the external analysis, must consider both micro and macro environmental factors, as well as the internal analysis, which will look at the firm's internal situation, along with all these factors we have talked about to determine which of the segments which have been created are best poised for the organization's global marketing strategy, which they have to be able to determine as a result of the strengths that they have by way of competencies and resources, as opposed to the weaknesses that they have in relation to the conditions within these individual markets. So when you get the slides, please take your time and go through each of these and familiarize yourself with the factors that will make a particular firm choose one approach, be it diversification or concentration over the other. And with that, we've come to the end of today's session. Does anyone have any question they want to ask or anything they want clarification on before we call it a day?